we have this seemingly quantitative physical world. This stuff studied by physics, made by science. So let's call that matter. And then you have this qualitative, feely, experiential, the blue of the sky can't be quantified in the same way that the length of the glass can be. So you have a qualitative as opposed to a quantitative world of experience. And the issue is, if that solid material, quantitative, real stuff is what's real, then why is there this weird ghost in the machine? Why is there love and the blue of the sky? How did this mechanical robot of a body that's made out of solid real matter, that's separate from the world around it, how does it conjure up feelings?
James Cooke, PhD. Welcome to the Accidental Gods podcast. How are you and where are you on this amazing summer's day?
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. Great to be here. I'm in Portugal right now, so a very hot summer's day, which is where I live these days. And I'm very well. Yeah, there's probably a lot more I could say about that, but we'll go with very well.
You're at home and you have a very small human at home with you who might turn up and join us at some point. So we're just warning people that a small person may join us. And we will continue unless it becomes impossible so to do. What's the small person's name and how old are they?
Leo, and he's 3 years old.
Okay, very small. Hello, Leo, in the background. And Portugal, because your wife is Californian, and Portugal is like California, but a lot safer at the moment. Not heading towards fascism as we speak.
Well, the far right party actually just emerged in recent years, and and Portugal is very its constitution actually commits it to socialism, but it isn't in practice. It doesn't kind of because it was the left who kind of led the revolution in the 70s against the fascist government. But it means that it's very when we first moved here 6-ish years ago, it felt like a kind of island of sanity in Europe politically, and it seems like that's slipping away, unfortunately.
Steve Bannon committed 50% of his time to Europe, and much as I don't like his ideology, I don't think he's stupid, and he knew what he was doing, and he saw Europe as heading further right than the US at that point. He thought he would get Europe flipped before he got the US flipped. Because they didn't have Elon Musk on board to put a thumb on the scales at that point. Anyway, let's let all that go. You are the person who's written The Dawn of Mind, which is the philosophy of consciousness and the science of consciousness. And I have to say, the combination of those two together, written by somebody who's really looked into both, reading that felt like all my Christmases had come at once. Having said which, I still had to read most of it many, many times to get it to sink in, and I'm not sure it has. So we probably won't go into all of the depth because we might risk losing people, but we're going to go into the basics of what it is, why you wrote it, how you wrote it, and where it might take us. So your intro to the book on your website says that it synthesizes science and contemplative insight to offer a radical solution to the hard problem of consciousness and the question of our place in existence, which is pretty darned fundamental. Tell us first what the hard problem of consciousness is and why we might care about it and how you came to care about it.
Yeah, so I think it's not a problem that we won't be going into all the technical details, because to me, these broad strokes of what is our place in existence, what is consciousness, where does it fit into our picture, this is what I'm interested in. This is why I wrote the book. And when you've got a kind of a misconception or like false assumptions, your whole kind of arrangement of how you're seeing reality blocks insight, and it just needs to be rearranged. So really what I'm interested in is that big rearrangement of, okay, it's like, okay, here's where we are and here's what consciousness is. And then the book really tries to do justice to that by showing how you go from all the assumptions for where we currently are to how I see things adding up. So the details are all there if people are interested in the philosophy and the science. But I think the big message is exactly what you're pointing to. So the hard problem of consciousness, the reason I zoomed in on that is, again, I'm interested in our kind of existential situations as humans who suffer and can be deluded and can have insight, and often that insight can lead, certain kinds of insight into our situation can lead to relief from suffering. So this is kind of what motivates me. And then the hard problem is really the gap in our current picture of what's going on in reality. When I say our current picture, I mean the kind of mainstream scientific picture of what's going on. And I think that gap is between experience and the physical world, the world that science studies, through kind of the objective space that seems to be in between us. And it's an issue of, well, how did those two things fit together, really? And it's called a hard problem because with all the assumptions of the current view, it can't be solved. It just doesn't add up. So that's really the starting point, is something's not adding up in our picture of reality. And that's why I focus on the hard problem of consciousness, because that's the articulation of what's not adding up. So then I present a different way of framing reality and then say, from this perspective, as far as I can see, I don't see a hard problem. I don't see a gap. Things seem to add up. And so that's really the point of the book, is trying to show a picture of reality that's holistic, where things line up, and that gives me a signal that there might be some validity to it, as opposed to the glaring error of the hard problem that basically is saying, you've got something wrong, go back and do your working out again.
Right. And so I'm still kind of interested, can we synthesize the hard problem? Because it's the nature of the gap, right, seems to me an expression of our separation from the web of life. It's the intellectual excuse on which the whole of our culture surfs and is in the process of tipping us over the edge of the sixth mass extinction if we don't change it. And it hasn't necessarily been expressed like this for the past 12,000 years, but the basic concept that says we are separate and we have dominion over all the earth is the basis on which we operate. And by expressing it as the hard consciousness, and I can't remember the name of the person who did, you'll tell us, they kind of synthesized, this is where we think we're at. And the breakthrough that you've made is walking us step by very careful philosophical and cognitive neuroscience step to, okay, guys, you made a fundamental error there. So I would like to, if we can, without losing people, walk us through the concepts, but we need to start where the gap is. So have you got an elevator pitch of what the gap is, other than we are separate and we deserve to be separate?
Right. Yeah. So you're absolutely right that separation is the issue. So if I go in and just give the standard, what I'll do is I'll explain how I see it, where there isn't a problem, and then explain what the delusion is that leads to the problem. I apologize if this is a slightly convoluted way, but I think it will offer more clarity. So from where I stand, you're absolutely right that the core insight is we're not separate. There is only, and one way you could unpack that kind of metaphysically would be to say there is only relationship, interdependence, relationality, Indra's net, and its existence is a single tapestry, a single web of connection, of relationship. And it seems to me that this cashes out in terms of physics, in terms of current work in what's called relational quantum mechanics, that sees the physical world as a tapestry of relationship. And then to me, what the mind is, what experience is a relationship. Technically, you might call it an epistemic relationship, which just means a relationship of knowing. So there's a stance of kind of knowingness to the world. And to me, that's what I argue in the book is that exists because of life. That's not because of brains. Brains help with that in us. But fundamentally, it's a way of the embodied organism relating to the world is what mindedness is. So in that picture, there's no separation, there's no issue, there's no hard problem. You just have relationality. And what we call matter is a certain kind of relationship. And what we call mind or experience or consciousness is another kind of relationship, particularly one to do with this knowingness, this epistemic quality in philosophical jargon. So that's what I'm saying is I think it's the simple picture where there's no problem. But then the way the hard problem is articulated, people are not seeing it that way. They have so the way the mind typically works is there is this sense of separation, of being a separate self, in a world that's made of separate objects. So not only are you separate, but the world is made of separate stuff. It's like a kind of a pile of junk floating around instead of an interwoven tapestry. And so in that view, you start to study the physical world, all these objects, and and they seem very real and they seem very foundational and solid, because I can pick up this glass and say, hey, look, this is a glass, I can measure it, and you can measure it and go, okay, well, if anything's real, that measurement of that glass is real, right? Um, and then we get into subjectivity, and it said, well, you said you think this, but I see it this way. That seems less reliable, less concrete. So then we're left in this space of, okay, we have this seemingly quantitative physical world that's the most real thing in the world, out here. The stuff studied by physics, by science. So that, let's call that matter. And then you have this qualitative, feely, experiential, the blue of the sky can't be quantified in the same way that the length of the glass can be. So you have a qualitative as opposed to a quantitative world of experience. And the issue is, well, if that solid material, quantitative, real stuff is what's real, then why is there this weird ghost in the machine? Why is there love and the blue of the sky? And like, how did this mechanical robot of a body that's made out of solid real matter, that's separate from the world around it, how does it simulate? How does this computer in its head, that's the brain, how does it conjure up feelings? Like, what are feelings? Like, how does that fit into this view? And so in that view, you're kind of taking for granted that that the brain is a separate object inside, or at least the organism separate from the world. And so you do have an issue there. Like, how are you going to cram in that ghost into the machine? Or how are you going to explain how the machine makes a ghost? Because then if you describe it in machine terms, you say, okay, we're going to build an AI based on brain, principles. Well, then does that have the ghost in the machine? And you just get into all these problems. Whereas if you take the relational view that I'm advocating, and you see consciousness as a relational process of knowingness, the gap doesn't arise.
And yet, there are people in our reality who will look me in the eye and argue quite seriously that person X is not depressed. It's just that their lithium levels are a bit low, and if we put their lithium levels up, they will cease to be depressed, which doesn't fit in my reality, which says, they need agency. They live in a world in which is depriving them of agency, and therefore their entire energetic being is feeling crushed. But the person with the lithium narrative can cite a whole bunch of papers going, no, we give them lithium, look, they cease to be depressed. And what I found in your book was that you were able to walk your way through that one quite cleverly. Can you walk us through that in ways that might not lose everybody if they haven't got PhDs in cognitive neuroscience? Because I think that's quite important. We live in a world where everybody feels beholden to the scientific model unless they've flipped so far to the other side that they are on other weird conspiracy theories, as far as I can tell. And what you've done, and what I really think and feel is important, is you've brought us to a grounded place where we don't have to believe that everything is just the molecules in our brain slightly misfiring because we haven't got enough lithium or whatever.
Yeah. The interesting thing about so with the depression example, antidepressants, typically increase serotonin. And so you had this simple toy model of what depression is just where your body's not producing enough serotonin.
Yeah. So then we have the ASSIs and yeah.
Exactly. So, but the interesting thing about the way you put that was, okay, they could cite all these papers. In that case, they actually can't cite papers because the science doesn't back it. It's for the entire time that's been hypothesis. It's just not been. It just doesn't add up. Like the data just isn't there. And I was taught this as an undergraduate that we still tell this story, but we know, the academics know it's not true.
Oh, really?
But
Can you unpick that a little bit? Because I've got friends who've taken selective serotonin uptake inhibitors and felt better.
Oh, no, they do. They can help you feel better, but it's not because you have a serotonin deficiency syndrome, which is kind of how it's presented. There's some really interesting work about certain serotonin receptors that help with active coping, which really fits with your narrative, which I resonate with about agency, where it's like, okay, well, if you're being crushed and you've got to keep showing up to work and keep going, if there's a system in your brain that can just boost that a little bit chemically, of how do you just keep struggling through, then it can kind of help you keep struggling through.
Right, interesting.
So it's not that serotonin is a happy molecule that you're lacking and then it makes you happy. But it's just, what's really interesting is the sociology of that because the pharmaceutical companies have this simple story they can tell people to buy their drugs, then the story gets told, even if the science doesn't back it. And the true story, as you say, the kind of the rich, relational, interdependent, conception we would need of what flourishing versus suffering is so rich and systemic in its kind of picture that I think people prefer the simple reductionist isolated stories of okay, well, I just have a brain disorder, because it's hard to wrangle. You'd have to do what you and I are trying to do, which is to wrangle multidisciplinary kind of takes on what's wrong with the world. And like that's the way out of depression for the mental health crisis.
And then you get to the point where we need total systemic change, and pharmaceutical companies are not in the business of advocating for total systemic change. So, all right, we'll get to the total systemic change in a while. So what we've got to is that the model of our brains that says basically we're just a very, very, very complicated computer, which is fundamentally where Douglas Adams got to. You ask it the right question, it'll tell you the answer to life, the universe, and everything, but it needs to be really complex. And in this case, they designed a complex computer that was actually the world, which I thought was rather clever on very many levels. But you talked to the guy, this is taking a bit of a jump, you did the first long form interview with the Google employee who came out in 2022 and was sacked for saying that he believed they were creating sentient life. And I've heard a number of quite smart people, including Asa Raskin, recently saying they might not have created sentient life, but they have created something capable of evolution, if evolution is a plastic response to environmental stimuli and a self-upgrading capacity. And I would be quite interested at some point in unpicking the distinction between that and consciousness. However, there is a lot of fear about AGI and ASI, and I'd be really interested in whether you think silicon consciousness can be a thing, and if not, why not?
Right. Yeah, so in the picture that I described, where, as I mentioned, I think of consciousness as a kind of relationship of knowing, or attempting to know rather than actually knowing, this kind of epistemic quality, to me, that because we're not separate, this phenomenon emerges out of the natural world with a deep continuity. And so it really is existence knowing itself, through living systems. And so if you build a driverless car and you're building that based on some vague approximation of what it is to be a living thing, it has sensors, like we have sensors like eyes, it can move by turning its wheels in the way that we can move using our muscles, and then you give it an AI brain based on how the brain works to some extent. Well, then you can say, well, why isn't that, what's different about us versus that driverless car? Why isn't that sentient, or is it sentient? And the way that I think about that is, I don't think AI or any of these systems are sentient or have experience. I mean by that, or conscious. And so the way I think about that is that they are fundamentally artifacts or models of what we are. So life has to pull itself up by its bootstraps, and that's why it needs to anchor to the world around it through consciousness. When you create an artifact, you're using your own intelligence and your own consciousness to do that. It doesn't then need to do that same process of kind of keeping itself together. So if I wrote down on a napkin all the equations that describe these kinds of processes I'm talking about in living systems and brains, no one would think the ink on that napkin was conscious, or the napkin as a whole, just because it's got the equations written on it. Now, if you put those equations into transistors turning on and off, and then it becomes an AI, exactly the same thing is true. You've just got a fancy napkin. You've not suddenly got the same thing. And so the same is true with a driverless car. It's a bit like, I can't remember who said this, but someone made this point about it would be like thinking that a simulation of a hurricane on a computer will get the inside of a computer wet. It's just a simulation or a model is just something different to the phenomenon itself.
And you had in the book a metaphor that I thought was quite interesting of the person in a room who's getting instructions in Chinese. Do you want to unpick that? Because I think I realize I'm taking us down a rabbit hole. Actually, I do want to go back to life and consciousness, but this feels really interesting. Tell us about the Chinese model, and then I have another question.
Yes, this was John Searle's Chinese room thought experiment, and he was a very important philosopher in consciousness. And so he was making the point that computation, in terms of the kind of machines that we have, deal with symbols, and they shuffle around this information in response to an input to give an output. But the system itself, the machine, doesn't know what the symbols mean. The symbols computation is something we used for problem solving that we frame. So like if I have a spreadsheet and it's got a bunch of numbers in it, and I'm looking at it and I know those numbers, say for example, it is like rainfall in a particular location, I can, add up all the numbers and then it will give me the total rainfall over that week. But as far as the computer knows, there's just 7 numbers and then an eighth one of them being added. Like it doesn't know that's anything to do with rainfall. So if the brain is a computer, who or what is giving it meaning? Like who or what is deciding what anything means? Why isn't it all just random structure, just numbers and quantities? So the Chinese room thought experiment makes this point that you can't get minds from computation in that way. Consciousness can't be the result of the brain being a computer. Because to make the same point, he says, imagine you're trapped in a room and you're given this task where out of, say you're a native English speaker who doesn't speak Chinese, and then you're given sheets of paper with Chinese characters on them through one window, and you're given a big instruction manual in English that tells you, well, when you're given this character, you give these ones in response through another window. And you just do this all day and you have no idea what any of this means. But it turns out what that manual is a manual, say, for translating between two. I can't remember in the experiment what it is, but the point is that it's like a question and answer thing. It gives you, they're giving you questions and then you're giving the correct answers based on this manual. So from outside the system's working. It's a question and answer machine. But the machine itself, you in this situation, doing the shuffling, or I guess it's you plus the manual plus all the symbols. There's no knowledge, there's no understanding.
You don't understand Chinese, but you're getting in questions, you're giving out answers, and it looks like you understand Chinese, but what you're doing is just matching with the book. Why did the individual inside Google believe that they had created sentient AI? What was the glitch in their human thinking that allowed them to believe in sentience?
Yeah, so I think the idea that so with that thought experiment, the idea is to say, okay, nothing about those structural relationships of you're giving these things in and out gives you semantics, gives you meaning, gives you significance. But not everyone agrees with that. Some people just dismiss that, it's a thought experiment, maybe it's wrong, or maybe the whole system as a whole somehow knows. And so people who believe that the mind, consciousness, is a kind of function of a computational system, like a brain, or thinking of the brain as like a computer, that's called computational functionalism. Like the function of being a computer is kind of what the mind is. And so he was basically, I think, coming from that perspective where it's like, well, if the brain's a computer and it can do these intelligent things and experiences, and my computer is now intelligent and it tells me, it's having experiences, I would look at that and say, well, it's a large language model that's trained on the kind of things humans say. So if you say, what happens when you open your eyes, it's going to say, oh, I see the blue of the sky or whatever. It's not going to say, no data detected, because that's not what humans say. So to me, it's an illusion. It's that thing of it being kind of a mimicry of what we are. But I can see why, if you have those assumptions in the background, you would say, well, why not? Like we've created an artificial brain. My brain can do experience, so why wouldn't this do experience?
Right. So it's predicated on the concept that the brain is basically just a almost quantum computer, or it's a very, very advanced computer. And your proof in your book is that this is not the case. So let's go back, because I am beginning to ask questions predicated on the fact that I read your book and the listeners haven't. So we have your concept, which is non-dual naturalism. I think maybe we need to unpick that. But the fundamental basis from a philosophical and a cognitive neuroscience point of view is that life is relational. Consciousness is a product of being alive. So in your world, not mine, rocks are not conscious. I think rocks are highly sentient, but I couldn't prove it. I can prove that I can build a relationship with a rock, which is a slightly different thing. So what is it for you that brings consciousness and life? How does consciousness emerge out of life? That's probably an easier question.
Yeah, so the way that I'm fundamentally open-minded with this stuff. I don't claim that this is the final word to ever be said on these topics. And the kind of the mission of the book was really to say to the mainstream view of no, this is something to do with brains, done machines, which I think we both agree is kind of a big part of what's wrong with the world, is that disconnection from the web of life and not seeing our kin as kin, but seeing them as resources. So the big battle I wanted to fight was to say, look, at least we need to bring this to all of life. Like, we need to at least see that consciousness is part of all of life. From there, I'm very interested in having conversations around idealism and panpsychism, and well, where do these things shade into each other? And actually, could it be true that particles, physical particles, somehow also show these kinds of dynamics? So I'm not close to anything really. But the point I make in the book is that the kind of processes that happen in brains that are correlated to consciousness, to the contents of consciousness, are processes that are required for life. They're not the Descartes was wrong basically when he said that. I just leave it there. Just saying Descartes.
Yeah, Descartes was wrong. Yeah, Descartes tortured dogs for fun. Descartes was wrong.
Exactly.
Those two sentences run in parallel for me. But yes, go on. Descartes was wrong when he said "cogito ergo
when he
sum."
said, but more the sense that non-human animals are just robots, basically, that they're just stimulus response machines. And as he was torturing his wife's dog, the kind of observation was, well, it looks like it's in pain, but you can see that actually it's just the lungs pushing air over the vocal cords, and that makes that sound. And so if you're a hyper-reductionist and you just look at the parts, you're going to ignore the dynamics of the whole. And I'm saying consciousness emerges with the dynamics of the whole. It's to do with being a whole living thing. So the empathic recognition we have of no, that's a pain state. That animal is in pain. He was just overlooking that. He was turning away from that when he was doing his experiments and thinking through this stuff and developing reductionism. So I'm bringing that back in, that sense of like consciousness is a systems level property of how we interface with the world. At least for us, I think that's what it seems to be, not something that's restricted to brains.
Yeah. And it seems to me, stepping back and lifting up a level, I don't know what Descartes' childhood was like, but Descartes, if we shifted from dogs don't feel anything to the actions of, say, Jesuit priests burning Inca people alive and saying, no, they're not screaming in pain, it's the devil screaming through them. It's the same kind of projection of internal trauma, as I need to say that X is not real and is not feeling real pain, because then I can justify having fun doing whatever it is that I'm doing. And we're seeing a recrudescence of this. We were talking earlier about the US, is they're heading very fast into white supremacy, which is the color of your skin defines your, not just your intellect, but your right to a certain degree of safety. And I had in the days when I was a veterinary anaesthetist, I had papers from the 1970s, so not beyond the bounds of modernity, by a professor in Edinburgh saying that babies didn't feel pain because they had no capacity to articulate it. It's like, what? And therefore we don't need to give them analgesia, which also was giving anything, the analgesics that they had at the time, which was largely morphine based, might well decide to make them stop breathing. So it's much safer not to. So I'm giving you a reason not to do something that might be anesthetically dangerous. So, and I read Lucy Cook's book, I'm guessing no relationship, called Bitch recently, which was just amazing unpicking of sexism being justified by science. Of I, straight white Oxford man in the 1800s, have decided that, I don't know, Dunnocks are definitely shy, well-behaved little girls who are totally monogamous, and the Dunnock is the model for human women. And it took until people were able to do the DNA examination of the eggs to prove that the Dunnock was heading out and would basically have sex with anything that would stand still long enough. And the male Dunnock was thereby raising a whole bunch of eggs that were not his own. People were losing their careers by saying, our observation is that the Dunnock is polyamorous. And they were sacked until DNA proved that they were right. And he's like, this is not science. This is the justification of our internal brokenness dressed up as science. And it does very bad things to my wish to have science as a fundamental thing. And reading through your book, there seems to me, both in the cognitive neuroscience and in the philosophy, quite a lot of people resting their entire careers on what seems to me quite evidently to be the same kind of projection as Descartes, dressed up prettily and given a name. And I wonder where you end up. How do you find a clean way through this? Because then I would worry that everything I believe is just a projection that I wish to believe, and now I'm finding good cognitive reasons why this number of angels dances on the head of a pin instead of your number.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the current kind of leading understanding of how perception works, how we experience the world, is called the predictive processing framework. And we don't get into details, but suffice to say that a key part of it is, instead of just data being received by the brain and it being processed in kind of a straightforward way, we're always bringing to bear interpretations, stories, what kind of motivated reasoning, what we want to be true, how we want to look at things, and then we filter what comes in through that. And
To
that
prove that
determines.
we were right.
So exactly, things like confirmation bias can totally come out of this. And so, but it also serves a role of emotional repression, where it's like, where it can do, where if you're fully in your stories, it's a inside out mode of anchoring to your identity, to your narratives. It's a mode of separation. It's a mode of pushing away the world instead of being fundamentally open and receptive to the incoming flow of data from the world. So I think whatever you call it, spiritual development, contemplative development, awakening, is on I think a neurobiological correlate of it is a shifting away from that top-down conceptual separation mode into a fundamentally open, connected, bottom-up mode, which is why partly why I emphasized before that I'm fundamentally open around, I'm not saying my concepts, my stories are perfectly right and are definitely the right way to look at things. They're a sincere contribution, and that hope can be of help. But I think that's how I stay on track with this, is that level of non-egoic anchoring to the world as opposed to what I want to be true. So I'm fundamentally open to the data. And why I love science is because of the spirit of science, and actually the mechanisms of it, of relying on data, are a beautiful corrective to this fundamental fallibility of humans, but it's not a perfect one. It's in the same way that in spiritual communities you get huge egos. In science, you get people who are very unscientific in how they see what they want to see instead of what the data is telling them. It's just our fallibility as humans. But doing that internal, emotional, contemplative, integrative work, in my experience, has been the thing that's allowed me to be a better thinker, a better scientist, by just being more open to what's actually the case rather than what I want to be the case.
Okay, because your Inner Space Institute for NonDual Naturalism is about bringing together cognitive neuroscience and modern secular mysticism and spirituality. And this, I think, really crosses boundaries. We have so much baggage in our world where people confuse spirituality with religion. And religion is an organized social construct designed to control people. And spirituality is a felt sense experience of a world that is bigger than the reductionist world that some science would give us. Let's talk a little bit then about your actual lived experience of spiritual worlds and of what I would consider to be mystical experiences, and we can define the difference at some point. So you started when you were very young. You started when you were 13. Let's go back to that and then build outwards from there.
Yeah, and I'll just say, since we've mentioned NonDual Naturalism a couple of times, that term is just a way of languaging what I said at the beginning about non-duality being non-separation. And naturalism is a kind of, instead of dismissing the world and saying, oh, science is entirely BS, it's like, well, no, we can think through the stuff and study the world, and we should attempt to have everything cohere so that we're not just turning back on certain aspects of reality. So it's really a way of languaging how I think about science and spirituality. Just wanted to say that to bring people along. Everything, I guess, started for me when I was 13, as you say, where so I was raised Catholic, and I was a very conscientious kid, and I guess I was always metaphysically oriented in some sense, because it seemed of huge importance to me to reckon with what I was being told about the nature of reality through this religion, in particular its relevance to I guess, to my own suffering, because what troubled me was the message that I needed to have blind faith. And if I did, then I would be in God's good books and everything would be fine. If I couldn't find that blind faith, then I was going to be punished for eternity in the most kind of awful way imaginable. And it would never, ever, ever end because it was eternity. And so that conception of hell and the fact that I was pretty sure I was going there because through no decision of my own, I just didn't have blind faith. I was empirically minded, and I could not find the logic, because there isn't a logic to jump from no evidence to a belief. And so my system couldn't do it, despite it really wanting to, it being sufficiently intimidated. It just couldn't do it. And so I was wrestling with this one day, like, totally absorbed in this, in this inquiry. And I was actually on the bus ride in Colchester, where I was going to school, outside the castle there. And I mentioned, because of your Boudica books, that we didn't get a chance when we spoke previously, that she loomed large in my education at school as a figure, because
I was wondering about
where I
that,
grew up.
right? And
Yeah,
for those listening who don't know, Colchester was the first of the three Roman cities that was destroyed by the Boudiccan revolt. So it's a big
yeah,
thing. There's a whole layer of ash beneath everywhere in Colchester where everything was just burned to the ground. So yeah, it's quite big in Colchester.
yeah.
On
And
you.
my parents' house actually was on a road where um, it's a Roman road that's like long and straight. It has a dike. I used to walk down like a pathway, which was one of the dikes the Romans built to deter her and others. So that was literally just like outside the back garden was this Roman defense against against her. Um, anyway, so yeah, I was on this bus ride, and my entire being was kind of sunk into this inquiry, because I just needed to figure it out. I couldn't just go, okay, well, I haven't figured that one out. I guess I'll go to the shops and then burn in hellfire for eternity. It's like, I needed to figure it out, but I couldn't figure it out because I was trying to figure it out through thought, and there wasn't a logical answer to the question. The closest you can get is Pascal's wager, where he said, for the same issue, well, just believe, and then you haven't lost anything if you're wrong, and if you're right, you get to go to heaven. But what that misses is the nature of blind faith, that you can't just choose. Yeah, it needs to be sincere faith. You can't just turn up to church. And so I was wrestling with this, and I think in retrospect it functioned a bit like a Zen koan, where the mind is banging its head against something that's insoluble. And then this instant happened where the thinking stopped. And yeah, it was, I mean, in Zen you would call it kensho, awakening. You could call it a mystical experience, but it's the problem with languaging it that way is there's a sense of like James had an experience, and this is waking up to the wholeness of reality, where there isn't a separate James. Sure, there's a body, and we can refer to that as James, but like there is no being inside this body that is separate from the rest of the world. And so it was this profound liberation, and just and so utterly simple, because it was just being present, existence being present for itself, abiding as itself. Just utter simplicity, utter freedom from any of, and then there was a seeing that all of that struggle had been manufactured in thought. It was a hall of mirrors in thought that I was believing, and it was all just some priests and other people had put some words in my head, and those words were kind of bouncing around. That was it, basically. Like, and once you stop with the internal monologue, there's a thing of like, well, none of those words relate to anything in my experience, anything I've ever known. Like, what is this help? Like, why would I? This is clearly an unskillful narrative. Like, why would I believe? Why would I do go down that road? So it was a total kind of unburdening liberation from that whole ruminative thought pattern. And also the no self thing is like that anxiety is really predicated on the feeling that there is a being inside the body who will die, and that is really, really bad. And when you see that being is a thought, not an actually existing thing, then the sense of there being a problem in existence goes away. So that really became and there was nothing in this experience none of this was like popping off to another transcendent realm or like interfacing with supernatural entities. It was just like utter presence. And I had this sense of, well, this should be utterly compatible with science, because this is reality. This is seeing clearly. And so I think it was the fact that I guess my life in a sense has been almost like devoted to that archetype of that kid who's suffering, wants a way out and wasn't being given a way out. I guess I'm on some level I'm trying to fill in that gap of like what young James didn't have, which was adults trying their best sincerely to weave together everything we know into a map of like what the hell's going on and how can we suffer less as a result. Um, and so, but that this book is quite an intellectual one that's really trying to lay an intellectual foundation. But I'm using it as a foundation to go forward into that more, that less heady, more liberatory space of relieving suffering, rather than just staying in the ideas.
And I want to look again at consciousness in a moment, but I'm really curious to know. First of all, I'm very impressed with 13-year-old James, of just having the capacity to think and think and to care deeply enough that that was focus and focus and focus, exactly like the Zen koan, until the borders break. Did you take that awareness into your social grouping? First of all, were there other people age 13 around you doing this? And second, what happens when you tell the priests, guys, this is all bollocks? Or did you not?
Yeah, I didn't tell anyone anything for I think the first time I told someone I was probably at university.
Right.
It was funny because, I mean, there's nothing to tell really because it's just reality being itself, which is always what's happening. And so there's actually no other. It's all the one anyway. So there isn't anyone else to tell. So it's truly. It never even crossed my mind to talk to someone about it because talking about it would happen through the delusion, happen through the
Yes.
sense of, well, I'm over here, you're over there, and we're using language to talk about something that's not us. It's just like what is pure beingness going to say to itself? Like, and also, I guess I knew people just wouldn't, because you're operating through that delusion, they wouldn't understand what I was pointing to. That would just look weird. So it just never occurred to me to talk to anyone about it until it kind of came, adjacent things came up in conversation one day. And I was like, oh yeah, I had this experience as a teenager. And then I just got this look of like confusion tinged with disgust in terms of like, what sounds like you're like a bit crazy, like what's wrong with you? So then I
Really?
was like, okay,
This
I
was
guess
at
so. Well,
Oxford.
that yeah, that was just the kind of, I mean, maybe that was just how my system read that expression. There definitely wasn't enthusiasm and curiosity. There was definitely a kind of like, yeah, that's weird was the
That's so
reaction.
sad. But you must
And
have since then met individuals who go,
oh, absolutely.
wow, yes,
Well, my
tell me
life now
more.
is about this. Yeah. So and it's wonderful because it's, I mean, what spirituality really is an opening. I think it's like a, and so I think that no reaction makes sense because it's a repression. It's a no. I know my stories. I know what's real. This is weird. I don't want to hear this. Because the other option is a yes, curiosity, open, which takes you into, if you keep going with the openness tone, it takes you into every part of yourself, even the darkest
Mm.
corners, especially the darkest corners. And so I understand why people would have a gut reaction of no, because if it's not being well held, then it's scary to move in that direction of openness, but it's wonderful and it's the best thing ever. So to now my life, yeah, is flourishing with these kinds of people who are passionate about this opening, this openness. But and that's why I'm bringing this more into, well, how do we hold space for more of this awakening,
Right.
this opening in the world? Because as I say, I don't judge or think it was wrong in any way for people to look at me with disgust because it serves a functional role if they're not being supported on the path.
Right. So, how do we support people? That's the key question is it. So, no, let me take a step back. It feels to me that we're in the bus heading towards the edge of the cliff of the sixth mass extinction. Turning the bus requires that we step into the non-dual naturalism concepts that you're talking about. That's that absolute bone deep awareness that we are not separate, that we are integral, that we have consciousness and we have agency, and that we could choose to use our agency differently. Which is, for me, it's both spiritual and there's that level of learning to heal the internal civil war that Dick Schwartz talks about, which has us. I don't think that happens unless we have a spiritual understanding that the web of life exists and we are an integral part of it. If we continue with our sense of separation, I don't see how we heal. So for me, there's an expanding ripple from understanding that we are not separate to being able to live as if we are not separate, to that shifting the whole of humanity. And how do we help 8 billion people to understand the non duality of things? And what you're offering with your book and with the Inner Space Institute is a scientific grounding in spirituality. And it seems to me that for a lot of people, that's going to be a route in that they will be able to step into. And the hurdle then becomes wanting to do that. And so I'm really curious to know how your book has landed in the scientific community. And then what are the practical steps that you feel you can help people to take that will help them to step into this in a way that is held safely so that it doesn't become
Right.
something that you resist against?
Yeah, I think that's partly why I'm passionate about science, is because that is the opposite of the dogmatic thing of, well, just believe it because I say so and I'm an authority figure. It's showing you're working out and having some humility and openness to say, here's how it looks to me, and I'll try and piece together all the puzzle pieces. And if you tell me a puzzle piece isn't fitting, then I'll look into it and we can look into it together. And it's fundamentally open and collaborative. Um, and so with that kind of spirit of also just showing that it's not, to the average person who dismisses this stuff as crazy, we'll say there's someone who's got some openness, but all their peers say it's crazy. If there's a scientist who can say, no, look, here's how it fits together, and then they can say, well, this guy says it's not crazy. Maybe to me, I'm hoping for some people that's a routine to kind of, to follow this stuff. And so, I mean, actually, with the reception within science, I've been astounded by how positively it's been received, because I had this, perhaps it was all those negative looks from my peers at Oxford. Not all of them, I only said it a few times, but I think I'd internalized a sense that people don't want to hear this, like they'll just dismiss it as woo nonsense. But in fact, I've been having very interesting conversations, very interesting proposals for things to come. So I think there'll be some exciting stuff to announce soon. So it looks like this is going forward in a significant way in terms of having an impact within science and philosophy, rather than just being. I basically just assumed this is my offering to the world. I'm no worries if people don't want to hear it. Like I get it. That was my kind of my energy around this, but it seems to have found the right people and the right resonances, which is great. And then
Just a moment, who are the right kind of people? Because I live in a world where as soon as you open the doors, a lot of people, like easily 75% of people, are desperate to be allowed to step through. They just think nobody else wants to go, so they have to maintain this kind of socials. And are you finding the same, that out there are a lot of people, you've given them the cover to
I think that's
step
what I've tapped into is there are people who exactly there's a whole stream of people who are desperate to make things happen in this space, in this direction, and just need it to be worked out and want to. So that's what I'm feeling, is there's momentum and energy, and there's an emergent field of stuff happening where this isn't going away. This kind of message about non-separation.
And is this in cognitive neuroscience and philosophy? And are there other areas where it's landing also?
Mainly in the science side of things, the neuroscience, and but the thing is the way that I do it. It really, the philosophers, they're already the people who I resonate with are already doing amazing work. So it's more about like bringing the scientists, opening their mind to those things, and piecing together the puzzles. So and then you mentioned as well the kind of the issue of how do we scale the holding of this stuff for people, and I think that that's going to be something I think I dedicate perhaps the rest of my life to, in terms of how do we do that, because that's not a trivial issue. And one thing I'll be doing is developing tools just to, on an individual level, to help people access this stuff more reliably, using science to do that, to make sure it's not just, okay, well, here's what I think will work, but instead checking what works. But then I'm very interested in group community support models for this kind of thing. For when I say this kind of thing, I mean spiritual development coming out of suffering. Because I think institution has a good quote from the theologian Paul Tillich, which is institutions are inherently demonic, and he included the church in that. And I think that's absolutely true. They're kind of very on a very structural level, to exist at that tier is to create structures that impede the natural flow of human agency. So I feel like I actually feel there's a parallel with the way concepts work in this top-down way we were saying in the brain, where like you create these brutal dividing lines, like how you know, Britain carved up places in colonies, just like drawing a line on a map, and it creates this huge rupture. I think the concepts and institutions do the same thing, where they, in this top-down way, they chunk things up, and then the connected, flowing, breathing like way it is to be a living agent gets disrupted. So I think doing this through, well, my doctor told me I need to do these meditations because it's been scientifically backed. Sure, it could be helpful for some people, but fundamentally we need to always put the power down to the base, down to people. And if we can build practices, guidelines for community holding of this stuff, I think that would be the truly transformative place that we can start to get into systemic change.
Let's unpick this a little. Why is it that community works better than an individual just going off and sitting in a hut for a month and doing silent meditations every day?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was comparing it more, you can do it the individual route. I was comparing it more to the kind of medicalized route where an authority figure tells you to do something. And I think really what a huge part of this path is agency, and is, as you were saying, and is, non-coercion, I think basically that authority dynamic is inherently taps into those, that lack of agency. So I think that's why invitations for people to step into their own empowerment, framing it that way, and having decentralized communities that can hold that well it makes a lot more sense to me than prescribing, my doctor told me to do mindfulness-based stress reduction. Again, I'm not putting that down. That can be hugely valuable for many people, but I'm interested in what does this look like in its most optimal form, which then does bleed into systemic change. And that's what it would look like to me, because it's just, given the relationality of everything, it's just how we're already totally interwoven and interconnected with each other. And so it's more just being honest and truthful to that, and trying to take the kind of the grown-up route of owning the challenges that will come with that, because it's not easy, to work in those spaces. But that's what I would aspire to for us.
And how, I don't know how to frame this, but I'm thinking of Jamie Wheal, who's put quite a lot of his life into finding ways that are wholly accessible, so you don't need the money to go off and do a yoga retreat, and that work. And he's come down to rhythm and dance and music, particularly in groups, certain breathing, again, sometimes in groups, and potentially, but with great care, the use of psychedelics, but probably not very often. And I've heard someone in his environment say everyone should do something once and that's it. And yet we live in a culture where people want to drop the tablets and everything will be fixed. And we're seeing a real upsurge in psychedelics will fix everything. And I know you have explored that route at least once, because you talk about it in the book. What are the cornerstones for you of helping people to open into a spiritual existence that feels authentic?
Yeah, I think so psychedelic kind of intentional psychedelic use to access the kind of shadow stuff and heal that was a huge part of my journey. And I used to think of that in terms of perhaps my kind of male conditioning around around kind of independence and doing things myself was leading me to do something suboptimal in terms of not finding as much of the relational healing as I guess this narrative thought maybe that would be more optimal. But actually now the way I look at it is I don't think psychedelics are often necessary if there is that relational holding, because people are ready to surrender the struggle and just let go into the present moment if they feel well held and if they feel the wisdom of that. And it's the holding is rare and takes a lot of skill. And so I think effectively these plant medicines there was a relationship there between me and them in terms of they were holding something in terms of I don't mean this in any supernatural way. I just mean in terms of the way I was using them as an adjunct, as a helper to my process. So I guess I see it now instead of an isolated individual doing something by themselves with a tool, that there is some sense of relationality there. Um,
But
and
what they
it
let
worked
you
very well for
do
me.
was
Yeah.
to let go when otherwise that was going to be hard. Is that what I'm
Yeah.
hearing?
They,
And that it's
they,
possible for people to learn to let go in company, but
right.
then you have to trust. I mean, this is back to us being
Exactly.
tribal individuals, and in a healed and whole culture, that exactly the tribe of the human and the more than human world is there to create what Francis Weller calls the container for the encounters with death. And that when you get there, the container will hold and you know it will, so you can let go. And our culture doesn't have any of that trust that we can allow ourselves to be vulnerable. So, what I'm hearing is that the psychedelics were able to crash through the lack of trust into a place where it was possible to be vulnerable. Is that right?
Yeah. So yeah, I would say they fundamentally, there was a lot of repression because there was a lot of trauma, and so they allowed the repression mechanisms to be disrupted. And so, there was relational holding in my people in particular who had all supports. Um, but and also, I guess I arranged things so that I was in safe environments where I knew I was safe, so that
Mm.
the kind of logic of this was allowing the challenging stuff to come up so that it could be overwritten with a sense of safety, um, in terms of like overwriting in the brain, the memories. It's almost like I was orienting to having a bad trip in order to then come to terms with the fact that actually everything was fine in the present moment. That was just my trauma history kind of bleeding into the present moment. Again, I'm not recommending or advising saying people should run off and copy what I'm doing. Um, but there is a lot of information and resources out there about doing this stuff wisely. Um, yeah, so it was fundamentally, I wasn't. It really fell on a physiological level. Like my system was holding so much that it wasn't going to let go without a bit of something to kind of ease off the brakes a little bit of the repression. Um, yeah.
And do you feel now that with things like the Inner Space Institute, I noticed that you say all institutes are demonic, and yet you have called it the Inner Space Institute, which is kind of cool. So
Institutions
we're trying to
is the
create
phrase,
it
but
as an
yeah,
institution that is not demonic. Yeah. Do you think that
I hadn't made that connection. That's funny.
I have it on the
I'll have to
screen in
rename
front of me?
it.
Are people going to, do you think, is it an aim to be able to overcome the repression and just be able to find ways to crack the concrete around our hearts
Hmm.
in company with each other as part of how we choose to grow? Or do you think that our culture is such that some kind of plant medicine concrete breaker is an essential part of our evolution?
Yeah, so I think the last time we spoke, you said something about I can't remember the precise language, but it was to do with how we need to be able to trust, but in order to trust, we need to be held, and but in order to be held, we need to have that trust. It's like a kind of a
Mm,
loop of, and so I do think the wise holding is, if that's there, then it's, if you have to choose one or the other, instead of recklessly throwing yourself, into a situation where you're not sure you can trust it, if there's that foundation, I do think that's maybe where I would build out first. And in that situation, I feel like psychedelics may be less of necessity, compared to a situation where you have individuals who are not supported, who are um, who feel fundamentally isolated, and so they need to just do this very contained encounter. Um, but yeah, I mean, I guess I'm fundamentally open to it. I used to have a kind of a narrative that psychedelics were definitely the thing that would do it, or the thing that we needed to use, and that. But now I guess I hold those narratives a lot more lightly. So I'm fundamentally unsure and open about the ratios there. But what we do know is we need both. I think. I do
mm.
think some lubrication of this process through something like psychedelics is of great utility, and then we'll feel through the ratios wisely would be the way to do it.
And what else are you using at the Inner Space Institute? Because there's quite a lot on offer, and it isn't sit there and take mushrooms. What other aspects of life are you holding such that people can bring them into the evolutionary space?
Yeah, so the main thing that is offered there through the membership is really guidance on the kind of awakening path, the path of surrendering to this present moment, not struggling with it. So I have a lot of guided practices, and there's a community there as well. And yes, it's really about kind of shedding the struggle with existence, which can look like, there are different ways we struggle with existence. For example, even just holding rigid beliefs around, no, this is the way the world is. That's a way of being closed to the evidence of what's going on. One of those beliefs in particular is the sense of self. That's that's the kind of the fundamental one that tends to make everything rigid. Emotional repression is another way we try and just avoid feeling what's really here. And even distractibility, just like believing your thoughts reflexively without seeing them as thoughts. These are the kinds of, this is the palette of what we're dealing with when it comes to kind of skillfully surrendering, which is to learn how to notice, in this moment, I'm mistaking my thoughts for reality, or in this moment, I'm repressing an emotion, or in this moment, I'm constructing a strong identity. I think there are about 6 dimensions there, which I don't think is too many to work with. So I've been fleshing this out into a model at the moment, which I think it's, as simple as possible without being too simple, these 6 dimensions. So that's what I'm kind of building out a version 2 now of the program there in terms of around this, to help people learn to come out of the struggle with existence, and surrender into this present moment, which is what kind of awakening contemplative development is all about to me.
Beautiful. And given that we're in the middle of a polycrisis, and for me, the felt sense of being an integral part of the web of life, which I think is my translation of what you just said, shifts how we are in the world. It shifts our energetic state in the world, and it shifts our actual behavior, because you can't keep being part of an extractive, destructive, consumptive process if that's destroying things that are part of us. Are you seeing with the people that you're engaging with who are taking this on board and beginning to do the practices, what are the behavioral changes that are occurring? Are there any behavioral changes? And if so, where are they taking us? I'm really curious to know, 10 years down the line, if everybody came and worked with this, can you see us in total systemic change? Is that where it heads?
So the kind of awakening stuff that I work with is, it tends to lead people, if they take it on very seriously. The main impediment to this work is the inherently conflicted state of the human condition. That part of us yearns for peace, and then a lot of us is fearful about what that would look like and what that would involve letting go of, and that's the whole attachment piece. And so people will sometimes say they really want this, but it's clear they don't. Their foot's on the brake. They're telling you they really want to drive forward, but they're fundamentally, their foot's on the brake. So when this is undertaken seriously, what it looks like is relief from suffering for the individual. Ironically, not for the individual, because it's kind of like you letting go of your sense of self, but it's more of like experience becomes a lot more fluid and free and unbound, and your pictures and narratives about reality become less rigid. So that, and I think that extinguishing of the egoic struggle, to me, is the deepest layer we can work on. Is the root, the thing that's pouring gasoline on the fire that also creates the fire in the first place, I think, is this egoic struggle, separation energy. So so this work, I think if everyone took this work on in a very non-linear way, it would diffuse our situation, because it would just be a returning to sanity. It would be a kind of it's coming out of this kind of psychosis delusion state of just being like a fearful separate self who's alienated from existence, and then say that happened tomorrow and everyone just instantly completed the path. You would still have too much carbon in the atmosphere, you still have these problems, but then I assume we would just get together in sanity and go, all right, well, what should we do about this, and start to build systems. So obviously we're not going to all just wake up instantly like that, but I feel like the opposite, the gradual path, where, because this path is about opening, if we just increase the level of opening instead of closing in the world on an individual basis, to me, that's what we have to be doing. And And that's what we said before about the kind of the top down, inside out. No, I'm in my rigid beliefs versus being fundamentally open and responsive. And that takes us into the unity, the harmony, the flourishing. So for me, that's what the path is that movement towards openness. And I think from that, everything else flows.
Magic. Okay, that feels like a really good end place. I'm aware that I didn't, that does feel like a good end place, and we could stop there, but I am kind of aware that I didn't really give you space to flesh out your concept that consciousness emerges from life and that life and consciousness are an indivisible whole. Have you got a
Yeah,
very
I mean,
brief how we get there?
I touched into that a few times. So I don't feel like I'll give it a quick summary though, just so people feel they've really got it. Um, the picture I showed before about how the brain works in terms of having beliefs or ideas or models about the world and then comparing that with incoming data. Um, that's a mainstream view in neuroscience about consciousness. And then really it's become clear in recent decades that that is true of all living things, that they have to do that process. They have to interface, anticipate, predict, in order to have the agency they have. They need to be simulating the world around them. So they need to be doing this epistemic interfacing that we call consciousness or experience. So on a scientific level, that's the kind of the core of the idea, is that the correlations we see between brain activity and experience are secondary to that process. The brain is in service of the living organism, just like every other organ. Like clearly we have a heart. The heart isn't the CEO of the body, right? The heart is helping the body to survive. But we have this weird story about the brain that no, it's the CEO of the
Mm.
body.
It's the
And it's a
computer
very smart
that takes
computer,
all the inputs and
exactly.
the outputs and makes sense of them. Yes.
And thanks very much, body, for being my power supply, but you're actually not very important. It's
Yeah.
utterly the other way around. Is that we are a living process, and the brain is an organ that facilitates that. It facilitates the switchboard that allows the sensation to get mapped to action and to do all this other cool stuff. But it's not running the show. Reality is running the show. But
And from
yeah,
a
so that's
philosophical point of view, what I found really interesting was the going back to the point where we're outside space and time and doing the kind of thought of what is it? What is if we live in a world where quantum physics kind of is telling us that everything is both particle and a wave and everything is energy. What is energy? What is the consciousness of the energy and from what does it emerge? And what I found very intricate and quite exciting was the understanding that gradually began to settle that consciousness and life co-emerge and 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 yet and I still can't remember how you did it because consciousness or life for me emerged quite a long time after matter emerged, and you managed to step through that one, and I still can't remember how you did it. Can you talk us through the philosophical basis as well as the cognitive neuroscience basis?
yeah. So the when it comes to that kind of quantum picture, I do think really what's going on in existence is, I mentioned that it's a kind of interdependent web or a relational unity or whatever you want to call it. But those happenings, those occurrences, those relationships, those interactions are they're not between genuinely separate existing substantial material things. You don't have two different particles that interact with each other. You have when a particle is observed, that interaction, the observation is the thing that weaves existence. Now, this is really hard for the mind to grasp because we like to think of things in terms of separate objects, but
Mm.
this is the relational picture that's emerging. So it's a fundamentally empty relationality, and this points to things in like Buddhism and Taoism, where the Tao, you know, the fundamental ground of existence is some empty fullness, some void-like, potent, blossoming, but fundamentally, yeah, void. It's not a thing, but it's just yeah. And I think I think that's really what's going on always. And what we call the world is something of a collective dream within that. I don't mean that in a way to denigrate it or to negate it, but its nature is that it's interwoven from relationships. It doesn't have, I'm not a materialist or a physicalist in the sense of like that there is actual solid substance. The reality is some insubstantial, interwoven, shimmering miracle.
Hmm.
And but that, I mean, I do actually say in the book, I'm a physicalist of sorts, because that's to do with like, well, whatever it is, whatever the patterns are we study and we call them matter, fine, like
I
that's
doubt if
relevant.
anybody listening knows what a physicalist is. I
Okay.
want to just read you a bit from part of the book that felt for me like on the philosophical side, the crux of everything. You were quoting Sartre saying, "Nothingness lies coiled in the heart of being,"
Hmm.
and you say, "So we begin with truly nothing. At the heart of everything is truly nothing. What is the nature of true nothingness? Limits or boundaries cannot exist within true nothingness, so its nature is unbound, unconstrained, infinite. This is synonymous with pure potential, as in an infinite space, anything that can happen will happen. At the bottom of existence, according to this view, is pure, unbound potential, empty of any inherent being in and of itself. What kind of events could happen in this space of empty potential? Given that it is non-finite, anything that could possibly happen will happen." You said that again. "In this way, non-being evokes being. Formlessness evokes form. Solid, stable forms would not be able to persist if they were grounded in non-being, but impermanent, insubstantial events or occurrences could arise in a relational manner." And I spent quite a lot of time reading that out to Faith and going, okay, I think this is the crux. And the sentence that I thought was both brilliant and either or a very clever sleight of hand was, anything that can happen will happen in an infinite space. I thought, yes, probably. I can't prove that it doesn't. That feels like everything hinges around that, and I'm not sure it's true, but I can't say why I'm not sure it's true, which means that's almost certainly my brain hitting a boundary. We're way over time now, but this, I'm really curious about this just because I find the philosophy of this interesting. You got to everything is nothing, basically, and if everything is nothing, then anything can happen. Fundamentally, that's what that was saying. Yes?
Yeah, so we're really in kind of speculative metaphysics here, and these are stories that
But that's exciting, James.
oh no,
That's the
I
fun
love this
place.
stuff, but I need I'm flagging it because I'm this isn't the kind of thing a scientist is supposed to do, but I'm doing it. But yeah, so the what I'm doing there, it really does feel to me like if you take seriously the idea that reality is empty fullness, being and non-being, everything and nothing, mutually two sides of the same coin. Everything
Hang on,
makes sense
stop.
to me
Why do
from
we
that.
take that seriously?
So
What's
I
the
mean,
grounding of that?
in my phenomenology, that seems to be obvious now. Like it's just what it looks like. Um, and other people have confirmed the same thing who go deep on the contemplative path. And so if you then take it as a possibility, you don't have to say it's definitely true, but then everything falls into line, and that's the signature of that's how kind of science works. That's how perception works. It's like you never grasp reality and go, "Ha, I've got it," directly.
Mm,
You vibe with it, you resonate with it, you come up with stories, and the stories are cashed out by predictions coming true. So that's how I work with this, and that's why you have to hold it lightly, because the stories are never going to catch reality and go, "This is definitely the right way to say it." So your hesitation around the infinite thing is probably really wise, because I had to use the word space there, and I'm not talking about a space. I'm talking about something that can't be languaged. I'm like
right. We're
true
back to the Tao
infinity.
that can be
So
spoken is not the real Tao.
exactly. So there are limits to it. But what I'm trying to do with that story is say it actually. I don't think it needs to be. I don't think it needs to be kind of weird or truly inexplicable as to why reality this should be the way it is. I think we are in this empty happening of infinity. So what I'm saying is, you start with nothing, but that nothing becomes, or it just inherently is, an outpouring. It feels like love when you connect with it, because it's just utterly unconditional, generative giving, because it has no way to not give, basically. So this is another way to language this feeling of the generative nature, the potential nature, of infinity. Um, and I mean, it's true that scientifically, like, if you just keep the clock running forever, if something could happen, my point there is like, okay, say something's got a 1 in a million chance of happening, and then you run it a million times, then run it another million times, and run it like run it for infinity, it's going to
It's
happen. Like
going
at
to
some point,
happen.
it's going to. So that's
Yes.
the point that I'm making there. Is like, and if it's possible for any flux, and this isn't like, okay, you've got nothing and now you've got something. The relational piece is like, well, up is not down, left is not right. Everything is cashed out against everything else. So you actually don't need an injection of anything else. It's just that I feel like, well, yeah, we're in infinity, and this empty flux of happening was birthed by this radical, unconstrained nature of nothingness, and that's why. And it's not anything other than the nothingness, but it is also everything. So that's why all of this is just everything and nothing all the time. The dance of being and non-being, the yin yang symbol. It's a unity and duality of like, it's not a true duality because it's two sides of the same coin. Um, that story makes sense to me. Yeah.
Okay. I have a whole bunch of other questions, but they would take us down rabbit holes that almost certainly nobody else wants to go down. So I think we should stop there because we're also way over time. James, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. I loved reading your book. If there's something else emerging from this that's coming up, then we can definitely have another conversation at some point and explore what that might be. At the moment, people can read your book. They can go to the Inner Space Institute. Is there anywhere else that they should find you to explore what you're doing?
Yeah, you could go to youtube.com/Dr James Cooke with the on the end. And you can find my YouTube channel, which has video versions of my podcast, Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cooke. There's
Oh,
also an
yes, of
audio
course,
version
there's
you
the
can find.
podcast.
Yeah.
I'm an idiot.
um,
Yes.
um, yeah, those are the main things. If I've missed anything, you can go to drjamescooke.com, and that has kind of links to all my stuff.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I will put up the Apple podcasts for people who don't want to have to download vast quantities of video in order to listen to some audio. So yes, obviously, you are host of the Living Mirrors podcast, which is amazing and brilliant and wonderful. And yeah, definitely, there's some really exciting conversations in that worth listening to. Super. Right. I will point everybody at those. They will be in the show notes, and we will endeavor to expand the people who have access to these ideas. In the meantime, thank you so much for coming on to the Accidental Gods podcast.
Thank you, Amanda. It's been amazing talking to you.